So now we proceed to our next speaker, which is already here. While we're preparing the technical things, I will present him briefly. Frank Kraushaar, coming from Riga, who used to work at the University of Riga, now has his own project, and as far as I see, he will talk us about Chinese aspects of the abyss, but rather from the point of view of poetics and aesthetics. And we're looking forward to what he's going to tell us.
Thank you, Sven, for your introduction. Still waiting for the slides to appear, but let me just briefly explain at the beginning of this lecture, which is, well, the slide is not there, but you may see it on the program. The title of the lecture, Chaos Matters, Reflections on Hundun and the Transition of Chinese Aesthetics Between Pre-Modern and Contemporary Worlds, seems to overlap already with some things Lisa has mentioned, and of course I intend to avoid this. Thought of this before I wrote down my paper, and basically took out of the considerations the focus on Hundun, which is who is actually, especially as an allegorical figure in the Zhuangzi. May know the Zhuangzi as a philosopher of the 3rd century before the Common Era. He is a very sympathetic counterpart of our biblical Leviathan, a representation of chaos, but not scary at all. And this is something I wanted to mention here and to stress at the very beginning, because it will become important during the lecture. Hundun, the allegorical personification of chaos, is not destructive. Lisa already mentioned that, but it is creative. So during this lecture, I'm basically going to focus on the abysmal as philosophical and aesthetic category in political discourse and art of contemporary China. I'm going to show you a few examples from classical texts, just to make it clear how do the conceptions of, or certain important conceptions of, chaos and abyss look like in classical Chinese thought or in Chinese classics. I'm also going to show you 2 examples from medieval literature. But then we are going to finish the lectures with a view on how these classical concepts are actually in contemporary China transformed in the context of modern contemporary arts. You may have heard of Ai Weiwei, who is probably one of the globally most renowned artists, conceptual artists of the contemporary era. And Ai Weiwei in 2019 had an exhibition in Düsseldorf, which happens to be my native city. And the exhibition was titled All is Politics, All is Arts. So here, the intention behind this is that in the conception of Ai Weiwei and many other contemporary avant-garde artists in China, or from China, I should say, art is something that in a way undermines politics without interfering into politics. And therefore, the notion of chaos and of the abysmal as an essential quality of creativity becomes important. So now I'm going to make a brief introduction, leaving this first slide on the screen, into this political context, which is necessary to continue then with the rest. In Chinese public media discourses under post-Mao communist regimes, which framed their policies under guidelines like reform and opening up, or scientific development and harmonic society, the idea of an abysmal structure of the world or of existence appears almost pushed aside into the sphere of esotericism. In the People's Republic of China, esotericism is as popular and as commercial as in other parts of the world, where much of the population lives highly rationalized quotidian lives, constrained by the logics of personal career success and the angst to fail. However, the ruling CCP essentially draws its legitimacy from the Maoist idea of democratic dictatorship, which is presented as conclusive as it actually excludes the possibility of failure on a level of collective political struggle. The concept declares the party to be the irreplaceable executor of the people's will. Deprived of the party's wisdom and unquestionable authority, the people, Chinese or other people, would be delivered to chaos and calamity. But neither of both would ever let it happen, because both party and people are indeed committed to the defense of collective freedom. So obviously, rationality within the discursive environment of contemporary Chinese party-state capitalism, which officially is called socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era, seeks to define the abysmal as critical to the construction of political power. Current public discourse in the PRC is based on two axioms. A, the indispensability of the party functioning as mediator between state and society or the people, and B, the progressive forces of history driving China under party leadership into this new era of its struggle for rejuvenation, meaning global greatness and leadership. China, without the party, would fall back into the disruptions of civil war as bluntly displayed by its history in the 1930s and 1940s, or, which might be thought of even worse, into self-humiliation by powerless obedience to foreign forces and blind worshipping of the West. So goes a public mainstream narrative, which on the other hand portrays the nation as currently re-emerging from the abysmal chaos of its recent history into a splendid future as the leading power of a world reshaped by its very rise. And again, without this incomparably great nation, the future world will be driven to the brink of economical, ecological, political, and last but not at all least, moral abyss and chaos wrecked by decadent liberal capitalism of Western-style democracies, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, you might be wondering already at this point whether I intend to give you a lecture on propaganda phrases that do not even sound inventive on the background of what we know about the public monologues of previous authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. This is in no way my intention. I rather bothered to sketch out at the beginning a general mindset, in Chinese a xiangfa, which over the past decade increasingly presupposes the language of power in PRC society. However, during the same time period, public discourse also constantly fluctuated between skeptical warnings of a fallback into the chaos or the abyss of the Cultural Revolution, and a renewed euphoria for the latter's so-called revolutionary romanticism, its implicit grit and valor, in Chinese 血性, or which means a passion for blood, and sometimes boldly proclaimed historical greatness. In other words, the humanitarian abyss of communist China, after some decades of critical enclosure by Chinese intellectuals, politicians, artists, and educators, now once again is drawn into the rhetorical dynamics of political struggle. This will sooner or later also affect the rest of the world, or actually already affects it, because the PRC's political leadership keenly seeks to establish its own values on international stages. So therefore, it seems useful to discern some of the more subtle understandings of the abysmal in traditional concepts and in contemporary arts from the present tendencies of an increasingly violent and intellectually oppressive official language. So now let's come first to these sort of classical notions of whom we have here to discern two very different ones. And I'm starting with the notion of chaos and disorder, which is very important in on the Confucian track of thinking. Yeah? So I will briefly outline the abysmal first on a conceptual level and then on an aesthetic level. We see here the Confucian notion of chaos is mostly represented by the word luan, which we see here on the first line. And this is a man-made chaos, something that must not happen. Man failing to meet duties they owe to their positions in a social hierarchy, which is identical with natural order, or the Tao of heaven. There are irrational powers, spirits, and their worshipping, and these irrational powers are linked to the abysmal sphere because they are so far away from the human world, as if there would be an abyss between both. And that is why, as you see also on this slide with the second quote, which is from Confucius, Lunyu, Confucius actually recommends to keep a distance, at any rate, a distance to all spiritual powers. And this is also reflected by the order of language, which in the Confucian mindset must strictly reflect the rational moral order. Thus, chaos in the Confucian sort of world must not matter. It should be avoided and is negative. Now we come to the Taoist part of the Taoist track of thinking. So, in Taoist classics, chaos or the let's say the productive deep abyss Hunyuan actually sustains life by hiding its perfect nature from any sensual distraction. With Zhuangzi, the abysmal clarity marks the sphere of transcendency, and its spiritual appropriation is a precondition of superior humanity. Thus, it is culturally productive. We have quotes like those I show on the slide. The first is from Tao Te Ching. Here it says, "There is one thing perfect in chaos. It is born prior to heaven and earth." This is just a thing. You cannot closer describe. It has no distinguishable qualities and attitudes. It's just a thing, but it is a thing. Yeah, it's there. But Zhuangzi becomes a little bit more explicit with the second quote, which is from the treatise on heaven and earth in the Zhuangzi compendium. And this goes, "I should like to hear about the government of the spirit-like man," one asks his interlocutor, who then answers, "Men of the highest spirit-like qualities mount up on the light, and the limitations of the body vanish. They carry out to the utmost the powers with which they are endowed. Their joy is that of heaven and earth, and all embarrassments of affairs melt away and disappear. All things return to their proper nature, and this is what is called the state of chaotic obscurity." So, in the tradition of Taoist thought, chaotic obscurity is productive and because it sustains the shape of the universe, heaven and earth. And the human mind that obtains this wisdom vanishes into the abyss of immortal truth. Yeah? The more you disappear, the more you are perfect and become perfect. So even in nowadays Taoist cults or religious literature, there is a story about Lao Tzu, the highest saint of Taoism, who is angry at his mother and doesn't even look at her after his birth. Her mother gave birth to Lao Tzu when Lao Tzu was already at the age of 81. And why is he so angry, the old guy, running away from his mother immediately? Well, because in the womb of the mother, he was invisible, indiscernible, and immortal. Yeah. Okay, but now let's go one step further. At an early stage of the development of classical Chinese aesthetics, fuzziness and indistinct depth become aesthetic markers of the sublime and the perfect. This is adequately expressed in the iconic imagery of ebriety, drunkenness, first eulogized by anti-conformists like the Seven Sages of the Bamboo Grove in the 3rd century AD, who also satirized the moral blasphemy of political culture by replacing the latter with art and self-cultivation, elaborating on the aesthetic perfection of chaotic obscurity. Centuries later, this persistent conceptual influence is clearly expressed in literary aesthetics as represented in the 6th century poet's Wang Ji prose piece, Note on the Homeland of Ebriety, which is not meant as ironic utopy. I'm going to read this here just for you, my own translation. The homeland of ebriety, the homeland of drunkenness, who knows how far away it finds itself from the focal states or the reality of the Chinese world at that time. Its soil is vast and shoreless. There are neither rolling hills nor steep cliffs. Weather over there is always peaceful and mild, without contrast of brightness and darkness, cold and hot. There, moors are of the great communality. No walled cities or fortified villages. People are just as they are and do not cram up feelings of love or hate, joy or anger. Breathing wind and drinking dew, they even don't eat the 5 cereals. They sleep calm and walk slow. They stay mingled with all the other beasts in the air, on solid soil, and in deep waters, and indeed do not even know how to make use of stuff like boats, cars, tools, and weapons. In subsequent centuries, the creative potential of the positive notion of the abysmal is unleashed, and this coincides with the so-called golden age of classical Chinese poetry. While the formal or the metrical sophistication of poetic language now sharply increases in the cultural milieu at the court of the Tang emperors in Chang'an, poets at once remain deeply interested in speculative ideas like emptiness, kung, and obscurity, xuan, feeling encouraged to invent these concepts in language and poetic imagery. Now, the 9th century poet Liu Zongyan authored a quatrain conformed with a strictly regulated 5-syllable prosodic scheme, the Qiyan Lü Shi, titled Jiangxue, or River Snow, which foreshadows the last 2 words of the text. So the title is actually the last 2 words of the text. And this is a poem which later on became one of the most famous quatrains of Chinese lyrical literature. I'm going to quote it here, not in Chinese, but in one of the 3 translations I offer on the slide. The first one is my own one, but I'm going to read Gary Snyder's one. Gary Snyder was a beat poet, or still is alive actually, at the age of 96, I think. But he was one of the beat poets of the West Coast in the United States who really very much draw on classical Chinese lyrical poetry in making their own new modern American poetry. And I'm first reading the translation and then telling you why I chose this one. So the poem goes, These 1,000 peaks cut off the flight of birds. On all the trails, human tracks are gone. A single boat coat had an old man, alone, fishing, chill, river, snow. While the headline River Snow, as I said, can be easily accepted as indicating the topic of a winter landscape at the heart of the following two couplets, these latter ones are constructed in a way which forces the reader to step by step give up on logical, grammatical clearness and surrender to aesthetic ambiguity. In doing so, the poet identifies, and the reader also identifies with the basically unidentifiable old man who is lost and at once omnipresent in the winterly abyss after a snowstorm. This is a typical example of an aesthetically productive abyss. It sustains the sublime or perfect in man and in nature by making both meet in abysmal obscurity. And at the same time here, we have the two concepts, Luan, the man-made disorder, and Hun, the productive sort of natural chaos, presented in one and the same image, because this poem is, and always has been read, in a political context of the time. Lo Zungyang was a contemporary of the age of downfall of Tang power. So the Chinese world was broken into pieces, actually, and I don't know a single reading of this poem from any period of time that does not bring this background as an important semantic frame for understanding the poem. Okay. Now, how now translate these sophisticated implementations of the abysmal, the Hunyuan and the Luan, in classical Chinese aesthetics into contemporary avant-garde art that currently reinvents classical concepts and formal features into what I would call a stylistic vacuum of postmodernity. And I will give you two examples. First, we will start with a performance, which I show you only by showing some slides. Performance by the artist Li Xinmo, born in 1976, entitled "Landscape Painted in Water." So on the first slide here, you see a pond, which is actually a dead zone of water. There are also water lilies, traditional allegorical figures of immortality. There is a white garment. In classical poetry, this symbolizes retreat from official position and social duties. It also symbolizes individual freedom, devotion to spiritual self-perfection. And the female artist performer seems to walk on a beam over an abyss. Nature, environment, and human individuality, death and immortality, beautiful composition and decomposition of nature. I mean, beautiful composition of the picture and the decomposition of nature here do appear interlocked. And on the second image, this is the continuation of the performance. We can perceive a symbolism of colors: green, white, red, which is cinnabar red, symbolize, particularly in classical Chinese poetry, not at all so much in modern Chinese poetry, but in classical Chinese poetry, these colors symbolize life, green, purity, white, and red, or cinnabar red, immortality. Yeah? Taoists actually believe that the drug of immortality is made from cinnabar. Yeah? And what we see also on this, in this stage, is the self-amortization of the performing agent, the artist. Yeah? Now, what is perceived here, if you have in your mind also motifs and motifs actually of classical Chinese literature is the motif of disappearance, reminiscent of poetic suicide as a leitmotif in Chinese traditional lyricism, refreshed in multiple ways by modern poetry. This is an ultimate answer to the existential dilemma. And of course, it is also reminiscent of the suicide of Qu Yuan, the first ever known by name Chinese poet who committed suicide in order to keep his own pureness. Only here, this all has an environmental context, which is very much the context of nowadays contemporary art, in a certain sense. And while in classical Chinese poetry with Qu Yuan, it has a moral and ethical context, the context of purity. And the final slide of this performance, of course, brings the whole thing also into the associative space of into a global associative space. We might think of failure here, of the death of nature and the beauty in death. So here at this point of the performance, the work also leaves the context of classical Chinese arts and closes up to contemporary world arts and intellectual and art cultural contexts. Okay, now we come to the final actually text I'd like to show you. And while Li Xinmo actually is one of the many nowadays many worldly famous avant-garde artists from China, she's also differing in that from Ai Weiwei. Still, or she is living in China actually. The poet Li Zi, or his true name is Zheng Shaoli, is a cyber poet, a poet who is writing exclusively on the internet, and this is actually a broad sort of movement, cyber poetry, that began already at the very beginning of this century, and Li Zi is a major representative of a very small part, but interesting part of this cyber poetry. He belongs to the poets who are writing poetry in classical language, which gives them some liberty to talk about things that are politically sensitive, because I mentioned that already earlier at another occasion, because the algorithms of the sensorial machines are not finding and not looking for even for the words used in classical Chinese. They register only the words in Putonghua, so in modern Chinese actually. So here we have a very special sort of milieu of literature, and some of the poets are really sophisticated poets, and Li Zi belongs to them. And this is a poem that, like many other cyber poems, has appeared already almost 15 years ago on the internet for the first time, and since then has been refreshed and renewed again and again. Certain lines have been exchanged, and it has been perfectionated. So I'm quoting here the last version of this poem from 2018. The first one was for 2002. And it is in my own translation. And as you will see very soon, this is a poem it's called Strange Omens, or Spring Snow. And it's a poem on this snow and sandstorms that are almost regularly overcoming Beijing. And so it is basically an ecological poem. It has a small foreword that goes, "This spring, the imperial capital," which is of course Beijing, "was overcome by bewildering weather conditions. There was heavy snowfall during the third month," which is April-May, because the third month is here of the old traditional Chinese calendar. Then following brutal devastations by red sands, which entailed one more flare-up of the struggle between the economy and the environment. So this is how the poem goes then. Breath of the cosmic bellow pocket, erstwhile tomorrow, now. Strange spring visions back then of steep appearance make a show. The northern fairy flowers, curbed by snow, they carry on and on. From western regions, sandy phantoms through the park groves blow. Is there to add a detail to the ups and downs of God's exalted plans? Widespread increase of loss and gain concerns all those below. 100 generations struggled, all concerned for failure and success. Who plays in this great game should never hesitate, but know. So here, obviously, this is my concluding sentence. You see, I just gave you a rather descriptive lecture in that sense. Here, very obviously, God's exalted plan is, of course, the plan economy of the Communist Party of China and Xi Jinping's vision of Chinese future, which is so much actually distinct and clear that one can sometimes even get the impression that you cannot avoid your future at all. Yeah. So here he builds a contrast between this rational idea of a world that is actually in the hands of man, and that very much appeals also on the background of traditional Confucian ideas, actually of morality and the way how the social space should be ordered and must be ordered, actually. And on the other hand, the chaos and the abyss of the environmental apocalypse we are facing nowadays and in China in a particular way. Okay, so that is what I wanted to tell you. Maybe you have some questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Frank.
Thanks.
Frank used most of his time, but of course I think we should have at least a couple of short questions, please. Sorry?
Just read a little bit of the poem, the first stanza
Yeah,
or whatever.
okay. You mean the poem, yeah? Yeah. Okay. 垂许多轮去来经，异乡当春俱江陵。悲伤化弦寄手学，细来煞怪消翠林。Was that a good answer? I'm not so sure, actually. I'm not so sure.
Any more questions of that or of another kind? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, you had at first your first example was this abyss of the Confucian period, where it was a struggle. Is it sort of the struggle, unordered, the chaotic struggle, or the opposition struggle between opposites?
What was the first?
Something chaotic. From very many different sides.
No, it's let's say it's a human chaos. It's luan. Luan means disorder, basically, and this is a notion that very much refers to the loss of let's say moral values, the loss of sort of human basic human understanding. Which is necessary for any society, even in the Confucian sense, this is quite a universal sort of framework that you need these sort of feeling for what is good and what must not happen, actually, in order to build a functioning and sustainable human community, actually. And when this is lost, then you have luan. And then people start to become wild beasts, one to another. And,
No system anymore.
Pardon?
No system anymore.
Of course, there's no system anymore. But even in the, I would say, in the basic Confucian conception of a moral world, there doesn't have to be any system. This is not about a system. It is much more about what the Confucians think is a natural feeling for what is, as I said previously, for what is good and what is bad. That is something that is pre-assumed. And if this is lost, so you must really cultivate it. And if it is lost, then the human beings become beasts, and you have the situation which is called run. Yeah. But of course, it is very important. It is also luan is also depicted in many ways in arts and in literature. And the way how this sort of human disorder is depicted meets the idea of an abyss very much. So it is something you can also not control anymore. It pulls everything into itself. At a certain point, you can't do anything anymore. Yeah? You need to wait for the right time to come when you are in a better position to start again slowly recultivate order and peace, and you build up human community. But it's not about making the right or wrong system. Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Once more.
Yeah.